Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. My name is Peter Steeves, and it's my privilege to be the director of the DePaul Humanities Center. And on behalf of the center and our gracious hosts here at the St. Vincent de Paul Parish, I want to welcome you to the Trials of Job. The story of Job is more than 2.5 millennia old, a work of poetry, really, that, as you'll recall, tells the tale of a good man seemingly caught up as a pawn in a game being played by God and Satan. The devil, so goes the narrative, tells God that the only reason Job loves him is because Job has blessed God. It's easy to love someone when he's showering you with grace and giving you nice stuff. Take away the wealth, the family, his health, argues Satan, and Job will no longer be the model of piety that God thinks him to be. To prove Job's goodness, then, God allows Job to be tortured. Little by little, the poor man loses everything he cared about on earth. His wife urges him to curse God and die. 3 so-called friends show up to discuss theology at length and investigate what Job must have done to upset God, since the Lord surely blesses only the devout and punishes only the sinner. And through it all, Job, his servants and children dead, his home destroyed, his body covered in sores, his only resting spot, a pile of manure, remains patiently hopeful and full of love for God, until, eventually, Satan admits he's lost, and God restores Job's good fortune twofold, brings everyone back, and lets Job live a long and happy life. For Jews, Christians, and Muslims, this story has been foundational. More than this, though, Job, as a cultural symbol of unwarranted penalization in the face of an all-powerful punisher, has become synonymous with unjust suffering in general. Poor Job is innocent, and we wonder why he's suffering, why God would allow bad things to happen to good people. Perhaps the question we really should be asking, though, is why do bad things happen at all? When is suffering of any kind ever truly just? That is the problem here that Job is unfairly suffering, or is it simply the problem of suffering in general? Though this is seldom the takeaway moral, with your indulgence, I'd like to say just a few quick introductory words about this, and then we'll begin tonight's evening's event in earnest. Consider, for instance, that venerable and most virtuous font of contemporary theological wisdom, Trey Parker and Matt Stone's South Park. In one episode of the animated comedy series, Kyle is in pain and questioning the existence of God. There follows a 2-minute animated sequence in which the book of Job is explained to Kyle. The issue is framed as one of suffering's relation to faith. We mustn't take our faith as conditional on getting rewards from God, goes the argument, but just accept that bad things happen, even with a good God in charge. Yet Kyle, more like a character in a novel by Dostoevsky than a cartoon on Comedy Central, fixates on the idea that God is using Job in order to teach someone else a lesson, to teach a lesson to Satan, no less. That is, Kyle can't get over the idea that God might allow horrible things to happen as a means towards some other end, completely unrelated to the sufferer and unknown to him. Ultimately, Kyle declares, wait, Job has all of his children killed, and Michael Bay keeps getting to make movies? There is no God. Now, we can understand Kyle's crisis of faith, even if it is in the end misdirected. For it seems to me that the point that he's missing, and the point that's so often missed by readers of Job, is that this is not essentially a metaphysical text, but a political one. That is, we should not leave Job thinking that God is best represented by an otherworldly, inscrutable power, and our lot is merely to accept this, to let it control our life, and wait to see how we fare as pawns. Instead, we get a serious lesson in theology from this text, especially by looking at how Job's 3 friends get theology all wrong, but Job gets it right. That lesson specifically is one that stresses how much God hates suffering and injustice in general, and thus, so must we. Job bemoans his situation early on, but at his lowest point, everything he loves on earth lost, Job does not give up his devotion to God. Rather than read this as a blind and naive commitment to a supernatural divinity, something I would argue, in fact, is idolatrous, and that it turns God into merely a magical creature we can never understand but just worship as a thing, Job instead comes to realize that loving God means, at least in part, loving what God loves. Namely, Job comes to realize that it's suffering and injustice in general that's horrible. Though he might have good reason to fixate merely on his own pain and sorrow, and he does so early on in this text, Job eventually realizes that this is not what it means to love God, that is, to keep faith in God. In fact, Job chapter 24, which comes just after the midway point of the book, is essentially a nuanced, even somewhat Marxist critique of the social institutions that have created the most suffering in the world: poverty, class, exploitation, indifference. Let me read you just a few lines from Job 24, keeping in mind that Job could be crying out about his own suffering and loss, but he has now chosen to look to the suffering of others in the midst of keeping faith. Evil people take the orphan's donkey and demand the widow's ox as security for a loan. The poor are pushed off the path. The needy must hide together for safety. Like wild donkeys in the wilderness, the poor must spend all their time looking for food. They harvest a field they do not own, and they glean in the vineyards of the wicked. The poor man must go about naked without any clothing. They harvest food for others while they themselves are starving. They press out olive oil without being allowed to taste it, and they tread in the winepress as they suffer from thirst. The groans of the dying rise from the city, and the wounded cry for help. Like the three friends who visit Job, it's easy to look backwards and try to find some mystical force that's made the world as it is today. Science calls this mystical force causation. Bad theologians, such as Job's friends, call it God's inscrutable plan. The search for causation is one rooted in the past. We look backwards to ask why. But perhaps the book of Job asks us to look forward, to see what our actions can make possible that is yet to come. Perhaps, that is, Job himself realizes that this looking toward others is more important than any causation question, more important than the empiricist's desire to pick apart the past for clues, or bad theology's crutch of using God's cosmic plan to explain one's own life, whether miserable or blessed. Such projects are always founded by a metaphysical approach that essentially erases suffering from the equation. Suffering shows up only in the abstract, only as a curiosity, only as either the firing of neurons or as something written in a cosmic script far away, rather than actual social political conditions made manifest in the bodies and souls of the beings around us right now. Science is causation, and bad theology's metaphysics thus make similar mistakes, never allowing the suffering of others, and thus the question of justice truly to emerge. So, the question we must ask ourselves tonight after reading Job is, how is it that we are fed by people who pick our food and yet starve themselves? How is it that those who operate the olive oil and wine presses, who pick the arugula to be sold at Whole Foods, who make possible all the rest of capitalist industry around us, do not own the means of production and thus work themselves to death in order to make others rich? How is it that evil people and corporate banks charge interest on us, foreclose on the widows and the orphans, and the needy must hide together for safety in homeless shelters under the L tracks? How is it that Job's worries ring so tragically true still for us today? The tradition, then, speaks of the patience of Job, and it's true that Job suffers without giving in to cynicism. But Job is anything but patient when it comes to criticizing the injustices of the world. If it seems that God does not answer his request for mercy, or if it seems as if God does not magically reach down and save the wounded crying out for help, then perhaps one of the main lessons that Job, and I, as a reader of Job, must take away is, I am not the center of everything. It's not all about me. But in order to love God, it's necessary for me to turn outward and realize that God hates suffering and injustice, and thus to be truly pious, so must I. And in this way, perhaps the book of Job is prophetic. Prophetic in that it calls us to be the sort of people who will make the kingdom of heaven spread upon the earth, rather than let it languish in ethereal metaphysics to come. In the 8th poem, then, David writes, addressing God, "What is man that you are mindful of him?" The poem goes on to explain how humans, though ruling over all living things on earth, are so puny compared to God that it's wondrous that God should ever care for us, ever keep us in mind. For what are we, after all? How could we matter enough that God would fixate on us? I wonder, though, if there's something hubristic about taking the psalmist at face value, something that misses the point of the trials of Job. Perhaps I am not the center of everything, but perhaps what it means to love God, to be faithful, is to put suffering and injustice in general at the center of my concerns for the world, and then go out and make that world better. This, at least, is what's on my mind as I read through Job. But we're fortunate tonight that there are far more learned scholars and artists than I who will share their knowledge with us as we try to think through what this text might mean and the myriad ways in which it comes to meaning. It's my great pleasure indeed to be able to welcome this evening Robert Maldonado, Professor of Biblical Hermeneutics in the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Fresno, as well as Richard Squibbs, Assistant Professor of English, and Christopher Tirres, Associate Professor of Religious Studies, both here from DePaul. The combined impressive scholarly work that these three have done, and the reputations that they have as careful thinkers and teachers, truly stands us in good stead. I'm so pleased that they've agreed to help us think together tonight as we investigate the political, ethical, historical, textual, and artistic meanings and implications of the book of Job. And we begin, in fact, with the artistic. Job is the first poetic book of the Bible, and this surely is at least in part constitutive of its meaning as well. And that poetry has inspired some striking works of music over the ages. Again, it's our great fortune that we begin this evening with performances of 3 such pieces. I'm thus pleased to introduce to you Robert Beatty, organist and director of music here at St. Vincent de Paul Parish, leading the St. Vincent de Paul Chamber Chorale in Job-inspired selections by Brahms, Byrd, and Joyce. Thank you so much. That was just a fantastic way to begin. Many thanks to Bob and the talented members of the choir. What a wonderful way to begin our evening here together. And I can't think of a better way to begin our scholarly discussions either than with Professor Robert Maldonado. So please help me welcoming him. Good evening. I want to thank the DePaul Humanities Center, St. Vincent DePaul Parish Church, the other participants, and Peter Steeves and Anna Clissold for their invitation and support in making this event happen and for allowing me my part. There are many, many fascinating things about the book of Job. Indeed, though, if I'm honest as a Bible scholar, I suspect that had not the synagogue and church survived, we wouldn't be reading much of the Bible today. To be sure, great works survive from antiquity, such as Gilgamesh and the Iliad. If the church and synagogue hadn't survived, I'm not sure what of the Bible we might still be reading, but I do think we could be reading Job. My focus today is on Job as an anti-theodicy, a critique of pious attempts to infer theological and moral order from suffering or flourishing. Of course, it has always been easier to point out the problems with theodicies rather than to render coherent the experiences which incite people to create them. Job is precisely interesting in its resistance to any easy resolution of these kinds of problems, or any resolution. To demonstrate this in our brief time, I would focus on three elements. First is the relationship in the book itself between the prose framework and the poetic middle. The prose frame is the story of Job and the adversary, and it's probably older than the middle poetic portion, representing an ancient legend that the author of the biblical book is using to retell his or her version of the story. I think of it a bit like C.S. Lewis's novel Till We Have Faces, which is a retelling of the Cupid and Psyche myth from a very different perspective and with different purposes. So too the author of Job is using an ancient non-Israelite legend to present perspectives on Israelite wisdom traditions. The characters of God, Job, and the companions could scarcely be more different between the prose and the poetry. God, in the prose, is boastful of Job, but rather removed, allowing the adversary to do his job on Job. Say that 3 times real fast. Job is pious and patient, accepting the tragedies that befall him without sin. This is the origin of the cliché, the patience of Job. The companions are positive characters and respond to Job's suffering with simply being with Job, a mute solidarity. Indeed, this mute solidarity is significant, as it gives Job's expression of his pain and suffering in the opening of the poetry an authenticity that is not reduced by having to be a response to a challenge by the companions. God in the poetry is angry, condescending, and browbeats Job into submission. The companions, while hyper-pious, are also contemptuous of Job, denouncing him as the author of his own suffering. Job, for his own part, is not patient or pious in the least, but complains bitterly about the injustice of his suffering, the characterizations of his companions, and blames God squarely for his circumstances. Job, the patient one, is replaced by Job, the blasphemer. Not only are the characters of the prose and poetry radically different and oppositional, the undergirding ideology of them is mutually exclusive. The prose framework has a basic non-retributional scheme. Job insists that both good and bad circumstances come from God, and they are not related to behavior and must be accepted. The premise of the adversary is that Job will blaspheme God if he is struck by calamity. Job's response to the first smiting is, "Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." For all that, Job did not sin, nor did he cast reproach on God. The second smiting has Job's wife take on the adversary's expectation. It's all about retribution, by her famous "blaspheme God and die." To this Job responds, Should we accept only good from God and not accept evil? For all that, Job said nothing sinful. The character of Job and the broader narrative reflect a non-retributional perspective. The poetry opens, however, with Job cursing the day of his birth. He essentially adopts a "why me?" and "it's not fair, I don't deserve this." Even the cursing of the day of his birth is a critique of God's wisdom and justice. The retributional underpinnings of the poetry is reflected in both Job's and the companions' speeches. The ability to say "why me?" and "it's not fair," or "you deserve it," presupposes retribution. If there were not retribution, questions of why and fairness are ruled out. Why me? It just happens. No why. Fairness presupposes some connection between what you do and what you get. In all this, according to Job, God is the enemy and the agent of unfairness. The companions, for their part, also presuppose the same schema, only differing on the evaluation of Job's culpability. God is just. You sinned. Learn from it, they say. The relationship between the non-retributional-based prose and the retribution-based poetry remains an unresolved and, in their exclusivity, unresolvable tension in the book of Job. My second focus is that within the poetry, two themes become stronger in the interaction between Job and his companions. The companions become shriller and shriller in their denunciation of Job and their pious defense of God. So, for example, in chapter 11, Zophar the Naamathite said in reply, "Is a multitude of words unanswerable? Must a loquacious person be right? Your prattle may silence people. You may mock without being rebuked, and say, 'My doctrine is pure, and I have been innocent in your sight.' But would that God might speak and talk to you himself. He would tell you the secrets of wisdom, for there are many sides to sagacity, and know that God has overlooked some of your iniquity." Or in chapter 15, Eliphaz the Temanite said in reply, "Does a wise man answer with windy opinions and fill his belly with the east wind? Should he argue with useless talk, with words that are of no worth? You subvert piety and restrain prayer to God. Your sinfulness dictates your speech, so you choose crafty language. Your own mouth condemns you, not I. Your lips testify against you." And Eliphaz continues in chapter 22. "It is because of your piety that God arraigns you and enters into judgment with you. You know that your wickedness is great and that your iniquities have no limit. You exact pledges from your fellows without reason and leave them naked, stripped of their clothes. You do not give the thirsty water to drink. You deny bread to the hungry. The land belongs to the strong. The privileged occupy it. You have sent away widows empty-handed. The strength of the fatherless is broken. Therefore snares are all around you, and sudden terrors frighten you." That's the companion about Job. All this is in contrast to the prose framework, which insists on Job's piety and goodness. In a similar way, Job's denunciation of God escalates. In chapter 9, "If this is a trial of strength, he is the strong one. If a trial in court, who will summon him for me? Though I were innocent, my mouth would condemn me. Though I were blameless, he would prove me crooked. I am blameless. I am distraught. I am sick of life. It is all one. Therefore I say he destroys the blameless and the guilty. When suddenly a scourge brings death, he mocks as the innocent fail. The earth is handed over to the wicked one. He covers the eyes of its judges. If it is not he, then who?" Now he is, and then in chapter 16, "Now God has truly worn me out. You have destroyed my whole community. You have shriveled me. My gauntlet serves as a witness and testifies against me. In his anger he tears and persecutes me. He gnashes his teeth at me. My foe stabs me with his eyes. They open wide their mouths at me. Reviling me, they strike my cheeks. They inflame themselves against me. God hands me over to evil man, thrust me into the clutches of the wicked. I have been untroubled, and he broke me in pieces. He took me by the scruff and shattered. He set me up as his target. His bowmen surrounded me. He pierced my kidneys. He showed no mercy. He spilled my bile onto the ground. He breached me breach after breach. He rushed at me like a warrior. And not to go on, I guess, in chapter 19. Yet know that God has wronged me. He has thrown up siege works around me. I cry violence, but am not answered. I shout, but can get no justice. He has barred my way. I cannot pass. He has laid darkness upon my path. He has stripped me of my glory, removed the crown from my head. He tears down every part of me. I perish. He uproots my hope like a tree. He kindles his anger against me. He regards me as one of his foes. His troops advance together. They build their road toward me and encamp around my tent. He alienated my kin from me. My acquaintances disown me. My relatives are gone. My friends have forgotten me. My dependents and maidservants regard me as a stranger. I am an outsider to them. I summon my servant, but he does not respond. I must myself entreat him. My odor is repulsive to my wife. I am loathsome to my children. I just have to include that last line. I'm not sure why. Let me emphasize a couple things from Job's speeches here. The quotation from chapter 9 is exquisitely ironic. Essentially, Job says that God is the judge, jury, prosecutor, defense, and executioner. Even if Job could get God to show up and answer him, all God would do is browbeat Job into submission. And that is exactly what happens in the book. God shows up and browbeats Job into submission. Second, in 9:22, Job says, "It is all one, therefore I say he destroys the blameless and the guilty." This could sound non-retributional, as it harkens by allusion back to the prose opening, but it is not. Job here is saying that that's what God does, and it's not fair. The blameless are, after all, also being treated the same as the guilty, and they shouldn't be. In the cycle of speeches, the intensification of the opposition between Job and the companions and between Job and God intensifies the tension between the prose and the poetry. Finally, in chapter 38, God makes an appearance, the ironic one I just mentioned. It's probably worth pointing out that this appearance also seems to violate the conditions set up in the opening prose between God and the adversary, vis-a-vis Job's alleged disinterested faith. The God speeches clearly respond to Job's gauntlet in a strong way. Chapter 38. Then the Lord replied to Job out of the tempest and said, "Who is this who darkens counsel, speaking with knowledge? Gird your loins like a man. I will ask, and you will inform me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Speak if you have understanding." God then batters Job with a barrage of rhetorical questions about Job's lack of knowledge and ability. Can you? Do you? Where were you? When? Nowhere does God actually respond to Job's questions. It is difficult to infer tone, but Job's response to the first speech seems to recognize this and is sarcastic. Job said in reply to the Lord, "See, I am of small worth. What can I answer you? I clap my hand to my mouth. I have spoken once and will not reply, twice and will do so no more." Essentially, Job is saying, my challenge is still on the table. I'm not saying it again. Back in your court, God. The fact that God speaks again is some recognition of Job's sarcasm. After more haranguing from God in a crucial but difficult to interpret passage, Job responds to God again. It is possible that Job is still sarcastic, but something does seem significantly different after the second speech. In chapter 42, Job says in reply to the Lord, "I know that you can do everything, that nothing you propose is impossible for you. Who is this who obscures counsel with knowledge? Indeed, I spoke out understanding of things beyond me which I did not know. Hear now and I will speak, I will ask and you will inform me. I have heard you with my ears, but now I see you with my eyes. Therefore I turn and relent, being dust and ashes." Part of the difficulty in interpreting this response is that there is no object to the verb in verse 6, variously translated as recant, repent, abhor, despise, or reject. It typically does not mean repent, and of course the lack of an object makes it difficult to know recant, repent, despise, what. This difficulty is intensified by, at this point, the prose framework resumes. After the Lord had said these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am incensed at you and your 2 friends, for you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job. God then enjoins the companions to entreat Job for intercession. This has to be one of the most jarring moments of many in this work. At the climax of the book, Job the blasphemer is said to have spoken the truth about God, and the pious companions are condemned for not having spoken the truth about God. It's not clear what of Job's speaking might be the referent here, but this does seem to be some kind of critique of a retributional scheme, in which people can infer from happy or sad circumstances the moral value of others. But in what sense, then, has Job spoken the truth about God? And if this is anti-retributional, why does Job get all his stuff back, 2-fold, and 10 kids to replace the 10 lost ones? It's difficult not to read that as a reward for Job's goodness, whatever that is, and thus affirming retribution. I will return to this by way of one more examination of the God speeches. One characteristic of the God speeches in Job, especially the first one, is the way they survey the wonders of creation and God's magnificent but inscrutable role in managing things from the stars and mythological creatures to eagles and ostriches. It's all breathtaking, and in some other context, beautiful. The most amazing thing, however, is the complete ignoring and overlooking of humanity. Apparently, humanity is not part of God's concern in the created order. As a child of the Enlightenment, I think I have a naive view of the ancients, but when I compare the cosmologies of Copernicus and Ptolemy, or Genesis 1 for that matter, I think of very different responses to looking up at the heavens, the wonders of creation. In a triple-decker universe with the Earth at the center, the stars shout to the wonders of God in creating this world, and especially of us. All of God's attention is focused here and on us as a pinnacle of creation. After Copernicus and Einstein and others, we are no longer the center. We are on a planet circling a third-rate star in a solar system that is nowhere near the center of the galaxy, indeed an obscure arm. And our galaxy is not the only one, and space is unimaginably immense. There were billions of years before we got here, and there will be billions more, not for us, after which there will be no evidence that we were even here. How can we look up and not feel dwarfed by all of our insignificance? And yet the author of Job seems to have more in common with this latter view than the former one. So in the retributional poetic speeches, Job and the companions argue for the justice or injustice of God. But for the author, God doesn't seem to be concerned with justice. We need another category, I think. Something like the Buddhist nothing, which is not the nothing in opposition to something, but that which is left when both somethingness and nothingness falls away. So here's an attempt. God is not just. God is not unjust. God is just, another category. God is what is left, or God's justice, or whatever this thing is what is left when our categories of justice and injustice fall away in their attribution to God. What is especially wrong about the companions' speech was that they added suffering to Job, especially via their attempts to justify God. Job did speak more truly about his own experience, as well as odd justice is more like injustice. It wasn't fair what was going on. Nevertheless, God's odd justice makes justice squarely the domain of human-human interactions and beyond. We are not off the hook. The author of Job seems to see how harmful theodicy actually is, especially in the form of simplistic and pious retributional schemas, similar to those found in Deuteronomy and the Proverbs. We have the responsibility to make a world which minimizes suffering, especially of the kind which paves the road to hell. If anything, Job is anti-retributional, but that isn't quite right either if both retribution and anti-retribution fall away. Thus, the tension between the prose and the poetry is a fundamental constitutive element of the work, It resists any resolution of meaningless suffering. Even the ending can't be taken seriously as retribution or reward. How is twice as much stuff enough? And 10 new kids to replace the old one? Seriously? It's the final pull of the rug. What's justice got to do with it? What's God got to do with it? Nothing. Thank you. Thanks very much. And thanks also to Robert for that great talk. There's so much to think about in terms of our role in the universe and the distinction between prose and poetry, too. And so what we're going to turn to now is a different kind of poetry and a different kind of poet. So please help me in welcoming to the stage Professor Richard Squibbs.
I too would like to thank Peter and the staff of the Humanities Center for inviting me to do this talk, and the fellow presenters and all of you for being here. It's a really fascinating event. Now, William Blake was a professional engraver. Doesn't seem to be working now. There we go, okay. William Blake was a professional engraver who lived and worked in London from the late 1770s until his death in 1827. In his time, he was known to most as a talented, if eccentric, artisan who also wrote baffling verse and painted strange pictures. Blake and his wife, Catherine, always lived on the verge of poverty, a circumstance worsened by Blake's increasing commitment to his own art at the expense of maintaining good relations with the printers and booksellers, whose commissions for engravings had given him a modest but steady income through the 1790s. Yet a small but devoted group of men and women recognized the visionary singularity of Blake's art, and their patronage allowed Blake to create the works that would bring him posthumous fame as one of Britain's and the world's most haunting and distinctive graphic artists. Blake's illustrations to the Book of Job are some of the fruits of this patronage. Across a roughly 20-year period, Blake produced 2 sets of watercolors of Job and a series of 21 superbly engraved plates. These engravings offer Blake's most elaborate reading of the Job story, which he casts as an account of one man's tortured passage from a benighted, law-bound form of religious practice to the state of spiritual exuberance and freedom that Blake associates with prophecy. Job's struggle for Blake is, allegorically, the struggle of every individual to discover spiritual truth, or, as Blake put it elsewhere, the struggle to display the infinite which is hid between the apparent surfaces of mortal life. What Job finally discovers through his trials in these engravings is that he has imaginatively created the kind of God who would allow him to be tried in such terrible ways. Job's return to prosperity at the end is thus made possible by his expression of this knowledge in artistic form, through which he comes to celebrate life, rather than trying to dominate it with a rigid, legalistic conception of faith. Now, this is a highly idiosyncratic reading of Job, but it follows from Blake's conviction that all deities reside in the human breast. Blake's spiritual vision is as humanistic as it is apocalyptic, and we see both elements at play in these engravings. He first produced a set of 19 watercolors of Job for his patron Thomas Butts around 1805. In 1821, Blake borrowed the watercolors from Butts so he can trace them in order to produce another set for the artist John Linnell, who then commissioned Blake to create the engravings, which he completed in 1826, a year before he died. And these engravings were in fact the last works that Blake brought to completion before he died. On his deathbed, he was working on a series of watercolors to Dante's Divine Comedy, and also beginning work on an illuminated manuscript of Genesis. Now, the shift from the soft watercolors to the sharp black and white engravings is visually striking. And Blake added quotations from Scripture and elaborate border designs to them, which, as we'll see, make more explicit the sometimes perplexing terms of Blake's reading of the book. The key revelation that allows Job finally to embrace prophetic spirituality is that being emerges out of the eternal strife between elemental contraries. Blake glossed some of these in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell from 1790, as body and soul, attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate. From these contraries, he concludes, spring what the religious mistakenly call good and evil. Good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active springing from energy. Good is heaven, evil is hell. Now, this religious mindset, which Job embodies at the start, abstracts its fear of spontaneous energy into a rigid system of moral law that, in Blake's view, represses the dialectical vitality of life out of which the divine spirit reveals itself. Now, the terms of Job's awakening to this revelation can be seen by comparing the first and last contrary plates of the engraved set. The first plate shows the perfect and upright Job with his family sitting beneath a tree. The postures of Job and his wife suggest their piety, as do the books in their laps, from which they teach their kneeling children the ways of holiness. Thus did Job continually. The motto at the bottom on a sacrificial altar, which paraphrases 2 Corinthians, "The letter killeth, the spirit giveth life," glosses what's depicted here. By reading Scripture literally rather than poetically, and practicing literal sacrifices, the burnt offerings Job performs, Job unwittingly torments himself with terrible consequences. Life eludes him because the spirit eludes him. The Gothic cathedral in the upper left, with what appears to be a setting sun behind it, given the sleepy animals, represents artistic attempts to manifest spiritual truth in the world. The allusion to 1 Corinthians, "It is spiritually discerned," indicates that this is the spiritual meaning of Job's situation at the beginning of the book. He and his family ignore the means of spiritual awakening available to them, the cathedral and musical instruments in the tree, in favor of a strict, literal legalism. In the contrary plate, Job and his family are standing, playing exuberantly on the instruments they've taken down from the tree. The Gothic cathedral might be obscured by one of Job's sons, or might be gone altogether, perhaps transcended by their musical enthusiasm. The books have been replaced by scrolls from which 2 of Job's daughters sing, and Blake associates scrolls with prophecy, drawing on Isaiah, Revelation, and other prophetic works. The sun now rises on the opposite side of the plate, and the animals have awakened. Even the bull and ram sketched at the bottom have exchanged positions, and the motto on the altar now reads, "In burnt offerings for sin thou hast had no pleasure." It would seem that Job has discovered, via spiritual discernment, the error of his ways, and now rejects ponderous legalism in favor of the pleasures of prophetic inspiration. Now, none of these details actually appears in the biblical text, but they all manifest Blake's poetic reading of Job's story as an allegory of the difficult and terrifying experience of prophetic awakening. In the time I have left, I want to show how Blake's use of books, scrolls, and musical instruments, both within the engravings and in the border designs, directs us to read Job's tale in this symbolic and allegorical way. Now, in plate 2, we see that Job's God mirrors Job himself. The Blake scholar Morton Paley has called him the chief bookkeeper, a vision of God based in Job's stern, legalistic approach to faith. At the same time, the potential for Job to recognize and embrace a prophetic rather than legalistic vision appears in the scrolls that the angels present to him, even as Job and his wife and children cling to their books. Plates 5 and 6 depict Satan pouring affliction upon Job. Now, Blake splits chapter 2, verse 7, "Then went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto the crown of his head," between these 2 plates. This cast we see in Plate 5 as a deeper explanation for the more literal depiction of Satan's action in Plate 6. Here again we see the chief bookkeeper, but holding a scroll in addition to the book, a detail that you can see that Blake de-emphasized in comparison with the original watercolor rendering. While prophetic awareness is still theoretically available to Job, the law remains predominant in his mind, and the cloud form suggests that this is all happening in Job's head. The Druid temple, which has replaced the Gothic cathedral, emphasizes the extent of Job's error, for Blake associated the Druids with the practice of human sacrifice, the dark contrary of the self-sacrifice represented by Christ. The quote from chapter 30, verse 25 at the top of the plate explains what's going on here. When Job justifies himself as a morally upright man, did not I weep for him who was in trouble? Was not my soul afflicted for the poor? Blake detects an attitude to charity that's motivated by scorekeeping and Job's fear that not giving to the poor will bring down God's wrath upon him. This kind of charity by imagined compulsion, rather than charity as a spontaneous expression of empathy, has in effect created the torments that afflict Job throughout the book. Now on plate 9, we see another instance of God imagined as a source of terror. This illustrates chapter 4, where Eliphaz asserts that Job's children must have deserved their death. For he asks, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off? Job and his wife look up in fear at the vision Eliphaz describes, a terrifying God that Eliphaz has made in his own image. This is the logical correlative of Job's chief bookkeeper, the full extent of whose frightening power is revealed on plate 11. The caption, "With dreams upon my bed thou scarest me and affrightest me with visions," paraphrases Job's complaint in chapter 7, verse 14. And we see how Job's God assumes the guise of the frightened Eliphaz from plate 9. They both share that spiky ring of hair. But this God points with one hand to a pair of stone tablets, suggesting the Mosaic law. The Hebrew lettering is clearer in the original watercolor. He is wrapped in the coils of a serpent, which signifies the material forces of nature that constrict Job's vision and obscure the infinite which is hid beneath mortal life, which the law seeks to regulate. His other hand points to the hell world, where three demonic figures, who might be Job's so-called friends and comforters, seize him and try to bind him with a chain. In dreams and visions, then, Job comes face to face with the horrors and torments of the God he has created. To conceive God as an angry, vengeful, legalistic deity is, in essence, to condemn oneself to eternal torment. As Blake depicts it, however, Job's ability here to visualize the consequences of his erroneous conception of God marks the point at which he can begin to receive the contrary revelation of prophetic truth. Now, plates 14 and 15 depict the fruits of Job's terrifying visions. God appears in a cruciform position, marking his transformation into a more merciful figure who reveals to Job the elemental contraries that drive existence, represented by the angel and the devil flanking God. A serpent and a worm coil across the bottom, signifying the natural world from which Job and his wife and friends turn their gaze to fix instead on divinely revealed knowledge and the angelic hosts who personify the caption from Job 38, verse 7, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Job's vision here returns to the joyfulness of the original creation of the earth before it became clouded by the legalism from which he's now breaking free. And then you can see the Genesis narrative recapitulated in the borders. I mean, I could spend 20 minutes talking about just this plate, but can't do that here. Now, this vision likewise enables Job to contemplate the monstrous land and sea beasts, Behemoth and Leviathan, from chapters 40 and 41, from outside their sphere of influence. These beasts are primeval parts of the created world that will finally be transcended through the apocalyptic return to paradise, towards which these engravings, like the Bible itself, are moving. Now, at this pivotal point in the series, Blake added 2 plates that were not in the original watercolor set, and he significantly altered a third. These additions and changes further emphasize the role that artistic creation plays in revealing prophetic truth. The first new plate shows the typological fulfillment of the cruciform God from plate 14 in the appearance of Jesus, whose radiance is too great for Job's friends to bear, even as he blesses Job and his wife. The caption, "I have heard thee with the hearing of the ear, but now my eye seeth thee," is taken from Job 42, the penultimate verses before Job ends that chapter by declaring that he despises himself and will repent, or however we read that. Now, the verses from the Gospel of John at the bottom reinforce the typological implications of Job's remark in chapter 19 that, quote, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth," which is, in fact, quoted at the bottom of the Demons and Visions plate. The influence of this Redeemer on Job is manifest on plate 18, where Job embraces the Christ-like principle of self-sacrifice, as opposed to his previous burnt offerings for sin. This is the illustration that Blake changed in the engraving, making Job offer himself before the altar with his back to us. We can see the reason for this change in the second new illustration that Blake added to the engravings, Job and his daughters. Now, Blake had painted a tempera version of this for Butts around 1800. We wouldn't have any works of Blake's were it not for Thomas Butts and his wife and patronage. It's just really astonishing. So Blake had this way of reading the end of Job's story in mind when he created the original watercolors. It's anyone's guess why he didn't include it in the watercolor set, but its addition to the engravings certainly brings out more the poetic dimensions of Blake's reading. Without this plate and the Redeemer one, the sequence following God's revelation of the contraries to Job follows a more literal narrative trajectory. Satan loses the contest and is cast down. Job embraces self-sacrifice, and his prosperity is restored. With the inclusion of the Redeemer, the new version of Job's self-sacrifice and Job's daughters, self-sacrifice now appears as the gateway to spiritual awakening through art, which then leads Job to his spiritual liberation. Job's cruciform position in the Hall of Art is the progressive contrary to his self-sacrifice, as he now faces us while pointing to pictures of his children's destruction from chapter 1, which flank a picture from chapter 38 of God appearing to him in the whirlwind. This dialectical process, whereby the contraries of law and prophecy are mediated and translated and transformed into spiritual liberation by art, is spelled out for us in the border designs that appear on the two new plates and on the altar of self-sacrifice one. At the bottom of the Redeemer plate, number 17, the books are mediated by a scroll on which the angel writes the verses from John in which Jesus claims identity with the Father, which suggests the emergence of Job's prophetic awareness. The design on the self-sacrifice plate depicts an artist palette and brushes with an engraving tool behind it, the one in the middle, mediating the law and prophecy, in effect translating the biblical text into prophetic revelation. And on the Job's daughters plate, both book and scroll have been replaced by musical instruments, signifying the transcendence of the written word by the spirit of prophecy. Blake's highlighting of musical instruments as symbols of Job's spiritual awakening shows that for Blake, what Elihu condemns in chapter 35 as Job's self-righteousness springs directly from Job's original legalistic conception of God. Musical instruments appear only once in the text of Job, in chapter 21, where Job questions divine justice by noting how, quote, "the wicked live, become old, yea, are mighty in power. The houses of the wicked are safe from fear," Job complains. "They send forth their little ones like a flock, and their children dance. They take the timbrel and harp and rejoice at the sound of the organ." In a crescendo of self-righteousness at this point in the book, Job contrasts his moral uprightness with the profligacy of these wicked people, whose momentary prosperity prompts them, in Job's view, to reject the ways of God. So when Blake represents Job and family at the end, acting just like those wicked he had condemned at the height of his despair, having exchanged the holy books for horns and harps, he shows how Job has come to embrace a joyful, spiritual enthusiasm as the proper means of expressing his faith. He has, in a sense, reinterpreted the signs of a holy life as lived in the world. With his vision now illuminated by prophecy, he sees that what he previously deemed wickedly transgressive is rather the workings of the Spirit within. And it is therefore fitting that Blake captions the final plate with a verse from the Song of Moses and of the Lamb from Revelation. For the transcendent synthesis of the law and the superseding word expressed in this song heralds the appearance of the 7 angels of the Apocalypse. From burnt offerings to the rising sun of prophetic truth, which carries the first 2 verses of the song in the original watercolor, we have moved with Job from law to prophecy and from Genesis to Revelation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich, for drawing our attention and for such careful analysis of details that might have gone overlooked and really open up both Blake and the story of Job for us. Thank you so much. As we move to conclusion then tonight, we come full circle, bringing back questions of music, art, justice, and politics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Christopher Tirres.
I'd like to begin with a word of thanks to Peter Steeves for the invitation to be here tonight. It's a real honor and privilege to be part of the very exciting and creative work that is being done by the DePaul Humanities Center. Thank you, Peter. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of some very special people in my life who are here tonight. Members of my immediate family, my wife, Allison, my eldest child, Eloisa, and we happen to have 2 visitors from out of town with us, who happen to be here. My second set of parents, my in-laws, Blaine and Marty Brownell. I've told you all this before in private and never quite in public. Thank you for bringing your daughter, my wife, into this world. It's very difficult to imagine a world without her and without my 3 children. So it's in this spirit of giving thanks to those people that are so dear and precious to me that I turn to the hard subject matter of this talk, which I have entitled Suffering and Hope in the Enchanting Garb of Poetry. I have borrowed this phrase, the enchanting garb of poetry, from the Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, who is widely considered the father of Latin American liberation theology. As anybody who has studied the book of Job knows, Job, as has been said many times today, is a book of poetry. This fact was not lost on Alfred Lord Tennyson, who calls the book of Job the greatest poem of ancient and modern times. My question tonight then is, what does this poetic book have to say about human suffering? If Nietzsche is correct when he says, to live is to suffer, but to survive is to find some meaning in the suffering, our question becomes, how then does poetry, in its widest sense of poesis or creative making, help us to find meaning in suffering? I'd like to begin to address these questions by drawing an analogy with another poetic creation, a modern-day song that carries echoes of Job. I have to remember to advance these things here. The song is from the Panamanian singer and political activist Rubén Blades, and the song is called El Padre Antonio y su Monaguillo Andrés, which translates to Father Antonio and his altar boy Andrés. It is from Blades' 1984 album Buscando America. So allow me to present this song first without any of its musical poetry. Let me give you just the nuts and bolts of the song that goes something like this. There's a Spanish priest by the name of Father Antonio Shejeda. and he is offered a very cushy job in the Vatican, he decides not to take it. He opts instead to go to the jungle to minister to poor people in the jungle. Second stanza. We are introduced to a young boy by the name of Andres Eloy Perez, who is 10 years old, and Andres is a full-fledged kid. He likes to play in the river, he likes to play soccer, and occasionally he likes to play hooky. In the third stanza, we find out that civil war has gripped the land. We know that Padre Antonio speaks out against violence in his country, and he says that love is the only solution. Then we arrive at the fourth stanza, the climax of the story. One day when Father Antonio is serving Mass with Antonio at his side, a killer enters the church and fires several shots at the priest. Here are the lyrics that explain what happens next. Father Antonio fell with the host in his hand, and Andres died at his side. Amidst the screaming and the mayhem, there was Christ nailed to the cross, looking down from the wall, agonizing once again. And no one ever exactly knew who killed Father Anthony and his altar boy, Andres. When presented in this way, the story is nothing short of tragic. A well-meaning priest and his innocent altar boy are gunned down and killed. This story, in fact, mirrors reality. The song is, by and large, a tribute to Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, who in 1980 was murdered while giving Mass. Romero was killed by a right-wing militia because he had been an outspoken critic of the many human rights abuses by the Salvadoran government. And what makes this song even more tragic for us here in the United States is the fact that this right-wing militia had been trained by U.S. forces at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia. When we engage Bladus' song solely at the level of content, this song is indeed a heart-wrenching one. But it is important to remember that the song is also a work of poetry, and the poetry of the song is best captured, I believe, in its musical feel and form, which in this case is unmistakably salsa. Let's listen to the song's very beginning section. And here is a snippet from the song's climactic fourth stanza. Bladus is here reciting the words that we just saw up on the screen a moment ago. When we listen to the song as it is meant to be heard, what are we initially hearing? Well, if your ears are anything like mine, the message I'm getting is this: it's time to get up and dance. Indeed, it's not hard to get up when the group's rhythm section is so tight and Bladus' voice is so sweet. So herein lies the first paradox of the song, that although tragedy is disclosed through the song's content, there is at the same time an unmistakable sense of joy and hope that is conveyed through the song's musical form. Social critic and philosopher Cornel West refers to this paradoxical juxtaposition as the tragicomic. As West puts it, the tragicomic refers to acts of human creation that preserve hope even while staring in the face of hate and hypocrisy, rather than simply falling into the nihilism of paralyzing despair. The blues and jazz are expressions of the tragicomic, but so too are countless other cultural productions that emerge out of the two-thirds world. Blades's song is one clear example of this. It's a story of tragedy told in the enchanting garb of musical poetry. Many of you, especially those who know Spanish, may have noticed from the last clip that I played that the song doesn't exactly end with the deaths of Antonio and Andres. Rather, Blades decides to return to the main chorus of the song. And this is what he sings in the chorus. In fact, the last 4 minutes of the song, nearly half of the song, is an extended vamp on this chorus with multiple ad-libbed lines. Here's one section from this extended vamp. In so many words, Blades is telling his audience, both through the harrowing lyrics and through the joy of the song, that the death of Antonio and Andres are in fact not in vain, for there are those who continue to ring the church bells in their memory. The ringing bells are not meant to stand in as an easy resolution for the tragedy, for the loss of these innocent lives is still palpable. But the bells and the music and the dance that it inspires all provide a way to confront this tragedy with a sense of gratitude and hope. Gratitude for the lives, however short, of these innocent victims, and hope that those of us left standing have the courage to struggle onward in their memory. As we turn back to the story of Job, the first question before us is, what would we lose from this Job story if it were not told in poetic verse? Let's imagine the story just as the plain facts. Think here, Book of Job, Cliff Notes version, which might sound something like this. There exists a very righteous and upright man by the name of Job. He is well off and he is conscientious. His children go off carousing, he prays for them. He welcomes strangers and takes care of the needy. People recognize him as the greatest of all the people in the East. One day, Satan tells God, "Of course you would think so highly of Job. You've given him everything a man could want. Take that all away from him, and you will see that his love for you is disingenuous. He will not be able to love you freely, out of his own will." God tells Satan, "Challenge accepted. You can wreak havoc on his family and possessions, but do not vanquish him directly." Job loses everything, is inflicted with loathsome sores, and is even pestered by his supposed friends. In the end, though, Job proves faithful to God, and God restores Job's status and wealth. The end. While this version of the story does capture some of the narrative elements of the story, it misses the larger picture, which is that the book of Job is primarily a work of poetry. As a work of poetry, the book leaves many tensions unresolved. But in a paradoxical way, it also points to new forms of freedom and wisdom. Contrary to what many people think, Job is not a demure, long-suffering servant. He is not an unquestioning believer with an ironclad faith in God. Quite to the contrary, Job is more like a slam poet. He uses his words, speaks his mind, challenges God, and fearlessly debates his friends. As we learn, it is through wrestling with God and his friends that Job comes to a deeper realization of who God is, or perhaps better put, who God is not. Here is Job in an early engraving by William Blake. Job is clearly exasperated. His eyes of his tormentors gaze intently and piercingly on the suffering Job, while Job has no other recourse but to look up to the heavens as if to ask, "Seriously, God? You take away my livestock, servants and children, and now I have to contend with this, the harsh judgments of my friends?" Here is another more contemporary painting of Job from the American artist Nancy Warner. In this image, two themes recur: Job's extreme suffering, captured here by Job's loathsome sores, and his sickly coloring, and the fact that Job is accused by his tormentors, symbolized here by the three fingers that point at Job. Again, Job looks up to the heavens and asks, "Really, God? Is adding this kind of insult to my kind of injury really necessary?" As an aside, I'd like to point out that there is also a profound sense of the tragicomic in this painting. The sickly Job suffers, but there are signs of hope. The left side of his mouth frowns, while there is a hint of a smile on his right side. Does Job know something that his tormentors do not? Could his Buddha-like stance connote some form of greater wisdom? Similarly, notice how the ailing Job sits atop a vibrantly colored carpet, and the grass around him is a healthy, verdant green. Warner's painting invites all of these paradoxes. As we know, Job's friends initially came to his side to accompany him in his suffering. As the text indicates, his friends sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. But after this long period of silence, Job bursts out, cursing the day of his birth. And it is precisely at this moment that the long poetic section of the book begins. These are Job's first words. "Let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said, a man-child is conceived. Let that day be darkness." Job's friends are horrified by this response. They begin to accuse Job of being impatient, and they begin to question if Job is really a righteous man. In no uncertain terms, Job's friends frame his suffering in terms of a theology of retribution. Job suffers, they believe, because he has done something wrong and God is punishing him. Job, however, insists on his innocence. He knows that he is not completely free from sin, but he is also certain that his calamity exceeds ordinary misfortunes. This realization emboldens him even more, as he says, "Therefore I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul." The problem, Job comes to realize, must be with God, or at least the way that God is being presented by his friends. Job ultimately rejects a theology of retribution. He rejects the idea that God is a God of vindication and punishment. I mention this important yet often forgotten aspect to underscore two facts. The first is that the book of Job is not about a single expression of faith. It is not about just one theology. Rather, it deals with the conflicts between two opposing views of God. The second fact is that Job's relationship with God is one of questioning and critique. Job is not a silent or timidly obedient follower. Rather, he trusts in his own integrity, using it to challenge God. As Job says, "If God would take his rod away from me and not let dread of him terrify me, then I would speak without fear of him, for I know I am not what I am thought to be." Job thus enters a real spiritual struggle with God. The important point here is that Job changes and grows. He matures in part by having the courage to question the image of a vindictive God that is so prevalent around him. But in addition to speaking out, Job also becomes a better listener. In particular, he becomes more sensitized to the suffering of others. Most often, we assume that the story of Job is about one man's personal struggle with suffering. But if we look closely at the text, we see that Job begins to connect his suffering with the suffering of countless other innocents. As Gustavo Gutierrez notes, the book of Job contains the most radical and cruel description of the plight of the poor that is to be found in the Bible. Job gives careful attention to the concrete situation of the poor, and he utters a harsh indictment of the powerful who rob and oppress them. This is chapter 24 that Peter was talking about earlier. As Gutierrez puts it, Job realizes that, quote, "To go out of himself and help other sufferers without waiting till his own problems are first resolved is to find a way to God." Or, as the great Sufi mystic Rumi might put it, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." In the book of Job, there is no lack of evocative, juicy language. Job is not a long-suffering servant who quietly accepts his fate. Rather, he is a boisterous and at times impious debater who is not afraid to challenge the reigning theology of his day. At the same time, Job's poetic insights also emerge from his ability to listen, to hear the cry of the poor in a radically deeper way. When we put these two elements together, we see that Job's wound does indeed become the place where light enters him. This does not mean, however, that the story of Job ends with a tidy or easy resolution. Although the text indicates that God does restore Job's fortunes, we also know that God never gives Job a direct explanation for his suffering. God does finally talk to Job eye to eye, but this encounter is for Job less about gaining clear reasons for his predicament and more about simply living with his reality. Job's encounter with God has less to do with his securing a sure form of knowledge and more to do with his acceptance that he does not know, indeed cannot know, what God knows. Job's response ultimately is one of utter humility and profound gratitude for the struggles and experiences that have helped him to grow. There is perhaps no better way to end than with a real-life story of suffering that was reported in the news just a few days ago. During his recent trip to the Philippines, Pope Francis met Glisel Palomar, age 12, who explained to him that before she was given shelter by an aid group, she had lived on the streets, where she had witnessed drugs and prostitution. Glisel openly wept as she asked the Pope why children were allowed to suffer. When she was done, Francis embraced the girl and a 14-year-old boy who had also been homeless. The crowd burst into applause. To the girl's vexing question, Francis replied, and I quote, "The nucleus of your question almost doesn't have a reply. Only when we too can cry about the things that you talk about are we able to reply to your question. Why do children suffer so much? Why do children suffer? When the heart is able to ask itself something and cry, then we are able to understand something. As Francis makes clear, we will never fully know why innocent children suffer. As Job found, there really is no adequate reply to a question like this. But this does not mean that we can't ask the question and begin to fashion at least some kind of response. At their best, religion and poetry help us to take this step. They allow us to face tragedy squarely in the eye and to transform it into something bearable, something transformative, and perhaps even something beautiful. Whether this emerges in the form of a song, dance, poem, painting, symbol, or gesture, such as Francis's consoling embrace, one message is often clear. Through suffering, hope. Through tragedy, transformation.
Thank you so much, Chris. Such important words to end on. And thank you for reminding us that a song without music and Job without poetry are not what we thought them to be. That the way in which we tell the story is at the core of the meaning of the story. And one can't help but think that the way in which we live life, the way in which we live life with and for each other, is at the core of the meaning of life as well, maybe part of the meaning of the story of Job. We've decided that rather than have a formal Q&A in the spirit of a real community, we'd like to invite you to keep the conversation going with each other and with us outside at a reception that we're very fortunate to have sponsored by the St. Vincent de Paul Stewardship Commission. And so we hope that you'll join us out there. I want to thank all of our speakers and talented artists tonight, and I want to thank you as well for coming out and being with us tonight.